to ask you if possible, even though you would now have to give the seat to Bo and to Kara virtually, I would ask you to please, if possible, remain in the audience to answer potential questions that may come ahead. And just an overwhelming thank you for these extremely interesting presentations. I will not be making conclusions of this first part now because, as I hope becomes visible later on, it is also very much interlinked with the second part of this session, in which we will learn about the experiences of two NSOs that were successful in requesting and implementing additional funding directed for SDG monitoring. For the second part of the session, I am pleased to have with me Bo Vogelfer. So close. I'm so sorry. And then Cara Williams from Statistics Canada, which will join us online. So I would start by quickly introducing Bo, that many of you may be familiar with. So Bo is an expert, an SDG expert for Statistics Netherlands. She has a background in transition studies, focusing on the transition for a sustainable society. And her work at Statistics Netherlands focuses on the development of a monitoring system regarding well-being and the SDGs. She's currently working on the development of an SDG monitoring framework for the Caribbean Netherlands and coordinating the recent efforts to develop more of the global indicators for the European part of the Netherlands. As an SDG national focal point, she's also responsible for coordinating SDG monitoring with ministries and custodian agencies. Without further ado, thanks, Bo. Go ahead.
Thank you. Is it on? Yes. Okay. Well, thank you for the great introduction. I'm just gonna dive right in because of the time, of course. So I'm going to give an overview of the resources and partnerships specifically for the Netherlands. And I have an outline of the presentation, so you know what I'm going to talk about in a nutshell. So first I'd like to introduce a bit of the topic and specifically some context for the Netherlands. And then I'm going to talk about the monitoring process that we had over time in relation to resources and partnerships, because this whole process that we have starting from 2016 has really shaped where we are right now. And kind of a spoiler, but we got additional funding, so I will continue on with the motives for this, and then how we are using this funding and the lessons that we learned over the entire period that I'm going to talk about. So I think most of you will know that we need different types of resources, and that's also the reason why this session is held, I think. And it's not just about creating the data, but there is also a large role for coordination and cooperation. And it's not just within your own country or within your own organization, but it can also be internationally. So specifically for the Netherlands, I think it's interesting to know that for us, or at least for the government, the SDGs were and still are kind of seen as a form of development aid. So they made the context for us a bit difficult, because the thinking was that the Netherlands were developed, so why would we need sustainable development goals? We just have to support other countries in reaching them, which is of course not true, that we would be achieving all of the sustainable development goals. But because of this, the SDGs were placed within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And also because of this, monitoring SDGs is not part of the regular statistical working program. So there is no standardized funding which comes with everything which is part of the regular statistical working program. So that is the Dutch context which we have to work with. So the monitoring process. In 2016, the Netherlands published their first SDG report. And it was completely based on statistics which were already available. For example, within the national accounts, a lot of indicators are based on the national accounts. And important to mention, it was on the it was an initiative of Statistics Netherlands, and we had no funding from the government. We did this on our own, and we really came to realize that the relationships within Statistics Netherlands were important to achieve this, because every expert has his own understanding of the data, has his own connections, and through this connections we were able to kind of gather all the available statistics and make a first report. And this report had a lot of positive response from society. And because of this response, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was willing to fund an update. So in 2018, we published the second report. And this was possible due to the positive response we got from society that really triggered the ministry into taking up action and provide funds to make an update. And the idea was just to update the available statistics, but also to engage with stakeholders to see what else would be possible. Then in 2019, the SDGs were integrated in our Monitor of Wellbeing. And this has been a bit of a key moment for us. And the Monitor of Wellbeing is funded by the Ministry of Economic Affairs. So all of a sudden, the SDGs were funded in some way by the Ministry of Economic Affairs. The budget of the Monitor of Wellbeing was expanded to include the SDGs. However, the focus became only on Dutch indicators, so indicators which were suitable for the Dutch context. And the focus on the global indicators kind of faded away over time. And developing these Dutch indicators became a priority. And to do this, we had to talk a lot with ministries and other stakeholders to really understand what is the Dutch context for the SDGs, what is important. And that created really good relationships with different people within the ministries, which we really benefited from later on. I think it's important to mention here that even though we talked a lot with the ministries and the funding came from the Ministry of Economic Affairs, they had no say in which indicators were eventually adopted and used. We had full control over that. They just provided input. So the global indicators were kind of not focused on, and the Dutch indicators were actually really developed. And that was, on the one side, a really good development. On the other hand, some of the tasks which the NSOs are responsible for were not receiving the attention they actually needed. And we, as the NSO, were aware of this, of course. So last year, in 2022, the funding for the Monitor of Wellbeing and SDGs had to be renewed. And the idea was to get a commitment for a 4-year period. And we saw this as an opportunity to get additional funding, specifically for the global indicators and everything that comes with that within the SDGs. And we succeeded in this. So I would like to continue to talk about what worked, basically, to convince the government to get additional funding for this specific task, so the global indicators. So we went to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because this part of the SDGs are still located at that ministry. And we asked for additional funding. And we, in return, we got a question back. And they asked for specific information. So what work are you supposed to be doing? What kind of resources do you need? So they wanted a very specified list with our requirements, basically. So what we did is we looked at the amount of global indicators that the Netherlands produced, and we quantified the number, basically, and we were very strict. We only counted the indicators that were compliant with the metadata as set by the United Nations. And then Lineke, I'm not sure how many of you know her, but she asked a lot of you to come up with a similar number so that we could compare and could kind of give context to how many indicators the Netherlands was producing. And we weren't doing very well compared to all of you when we looked at this. So we could really identify the data gaps that we had. And by specifying the amount of indicators that we have and that all of you produced, it really was an eye-opener for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In addition, we used UN resolution, and I mentioned the specifics in the slide, which one, and I think it's mentioned a couple of times here already today. And in this resolution, it states which the responsibilities for the NSOs are. And it's not just creating the data, but it's also coordinating and cooperating. So by using this UN resolution, we could really stress these are the tasks that we are supposed to be doing, and this is what we're doing now, which wasn't even coming close to what we should be doing. And then we specified the resources that we needed to be able to perform the tasks as stated in the UN resolution. And because we could specify it, the ministry agreed and granted us the resources that we needed for the next 4 years, because we are talking about the 4-year period for the entire monitor of well-being and sustainable development goals. So how are we using this funding? Some of the funding has been allocated within the agreement that we made with the ministry, so we have to use it for specific activities. And I think these activities on the slide are kind of a summarize of that. So of course we have to develop and update the global indicators. But also coordinating with SDG focal points within the ministries is a really big part of it. So within the Netherlands, each ministry has its own SDG focal point. And the job of this focal point is to know everything that is going on within the ministry related to the SDGs. So when custodian agencies approach a ministry instead of the statistical office for data, the SDG focal point of the ministry is aware of this, will contact me to keep me in the loop so that we are all aware of all the data streams that are occurring between the Netherlands and the custodian agencies. And this is a really big part of the coordinating job within the Netherlands itself. In addition, we provide country data to custodian agencies, and this goes way smoothly because of the coordination we have with all the SDG focal points within the Netherlands. And of course, contributing to international cooperation. Yeah, the lessons learned basically throughout the entire process, and I think I mentioned all of them. This is more of a summary. We really experienced that partnerships and resources are interconnected. So of course you need resources to do the monitoring work. And partnerships can provide these resources, but resources also make it possible to maintain your partnerships and to create new ones. Also to be able to speak at different conferences or gatherings. Doesn't really matter what type. You can get new connections, which can result into new partnerships, which can create new resources. But you do need the resources to attend. You do need the resources, the time actually to do those things, which are not creating the data, which is our core business. Then the next one is make the current state of your monitoring really clear. So this really helped us to convince the ministry of that we really needed this funding to improve our work. So in our case, specify the current number of indicators. Sometimes it's a bit difficult because you can make a proxy or something that comes close to it. But if the metadata doesn't match the one that we are supposed to, the one that it's supposed to match, it's not really useful to make a global picture of how we're doing globally. So we didn't count it if it didn't match. So when you specify what types of indicators you count and what types you do not count, it is possible to come up with a number, even though it's not as high as you would like. Specify what could be achieved, so which indicators can you make, but also activities that you can do which have nothing to do with making the actual data. And connect resources that you need to specific tasks, so it's clear what you can achieve with specific types of resources. And of course, provide context. So being able to compare it, the amount of indicators that we make with a number of other countries really made all the difference. So thanks again for helping us doing this. And relationships outside of the government are also key. So if you didn't have that positive response from society in 2016, you could never have made the update in 2018 and everything else that followed. And indirectly, this really contributes to obtaining resources and especially to the resources we have right now. That was it.
Perfect.
So, if there are any questions?
Thank you so much, Bo. This was an extremely interesting presentation. I think lots of us are I think jealous is maybe too heavy a word, but just a great thank you. I would now quickly move on to the next presentation. I would just like to check that Cara is online.
I am here. Can you hear me?
Thanks. It's lovely hearing you. Yes, we can hear you perfectly. So I would briefly introduce Cara, although many of you are very well acquainted with her. So Cara Williams is the Assistant Director of International Cooperation and Methodology Innovation Center at Statistics Canada, where she oversees Statistics Canada's SDG unit, among other things, such as Quality and Data Ethics Secretariat. She's also currently the co-chair and Canadian representative of the United Nations Interagency and Expert Advisory Group for Sustainable Development Goal Indicators, as Sarah mentioned earlier this morning. And prior to this, Cara has worked as the editor-in-chief of Canadian Social Trends, as a senior researcher for Perspectives on Labor and Income at Statistics Canada. So as you can see, as she has an extensive curriculum and a portfolio, very much relevant to what we are discussing today. So I would now, without further ado, give the floor to you, Cara, and just thank you for being able to log online.
Thank you, Carolina. Hello, everybody. I hope you are all well, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person today. Okay, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we secured resources for SDG measurement at Statistics Canada. And you know, the kind of the path that we took to be able to secure those resources. Next slide, please. So what is our role? We're the central focal point for reporting on Canada's progress on Agenda 2030. So we collect, analyze, and disseminate data for the reporting of the global and the domestic SDG framework. And we can go to the next slide, please. So way back in 2014, Statistics Canada started measuring or started examining measurement of what would become the SDGs. So I'm not sure if anybody here recalls, but back in 2014, the UN sent out this survey monkey of topics that they thought were going to be that would be under the post-2015 agenda, which would later become the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And so we looked at, could we measure these topics? So we started looking at it, and the targets were not yet finalized. It was just kind of topic based. At this point, Statistics Canada was the only government department working on the Sustainable Development Goals in Canada, apart from Global Affairs Canada, which of course was negotiating the SDGs, but nobody else was looking at them. The government was a conservative government at the time, and as such was not heavily involved in the post-2015 agenda. So you can go to the next slide, please. So in 2015, StatCan requested to be on the IEAG during the UNECE discussions of the regional membership. So our sub-region was the United States and Canada requested the IEAG, and the United States was put on the HLG at that point. Again, even after the 2030 agenda was adopted by the United Nations, between 2015 and 2017, Statistics Canada was the only federal government department working on SDGs. And so we consulted widely on the development of the global indicator framework. So we would talk to the other departments on whether they thought the indicator was well represented the targets, whether we could measure it, if we wanted to ensure there was no political leaning within the indicators. So we had these massive consultations. Many of you may remember the green and gray indicators. That was pre-tiering. And there was no plan at the time for domestic implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the government of the day said that no, there would be no domestic implementation. We could report on the global indicators to the UN, but no domestic implementation. In 2017, there was an election in Canada, and things changed very quickly. And that was when the government decided that there would be domestic implementation. So you can go on to the next slide, please. So up until 2017, Statistics Canada was not receiving any funding to do any of the work on SDGs, which we were doing. But in the 2018 budget, there was a paragraph that said, to support reporting and ensure continued progress and coordination of our efforts on the SDGs domestically and internationally, the government proposes $49.4 million over 13 years, starting in the 2018-19 year, to establish an SDG unit and fund monitoring and reporting activities by Statistics Canada. And I'll leave that there. You can read the rest of this. So imagine our surprise, because it looks like Statistics Canada received $49.4 million for SDGs, and the number of phone calls and emails that we received about this massive amount of money from other departments wanting their cut of it was really quite phenomenal. However, if you go to the next slide, please. The devil is in the details on this. We did not receive $49.4 million over the 13 years. Indeed, the large majority of that money went to Employment and Social Development Canada. They are the department that is responsible for domestic implementation of the SDGs. They are the policy department. Statistics Canada received just over $500,000 per year to develop and report on national SDG indicators, to build reporting platforms and any other reporting tools, to continue to work in the international sphere on SDGs, and to examine other existing data to determine feasibility for SDG reporting. So we got just over 500,000. No new data collection activities were funded. So we could not, there was no surveys funded. So that we could not add any collection vehicles to that. We had to search within existing data sources, not only within Statistics Canada, but outside of Statistics Canada, to see if any data were appropriate to be able to report on SDGs. Next slide, please. So what have we done since 2018? And I just want to refer back to Bo's presentation. She talked about the Netherlands focusing on the domestic indicators. Certainly for the policy departments within the Government of Canada, they focused very heavily on the development of domestic indicators for SDGs. And in fact, until very recently, we could not convince them of the relevance of the global indicator framework. So a lot of effort was put into the development of a Canadian indicator framework for SDGs and reporting on these indicators. At the same time, Statistics Canada continues to report on the global indicator framework. So since 2018, we've released 2 data hubs, one on the global framework, one on the domestic framework, and we're just about to release a third. In 2020, we did SDG fact sheets. And in 2022-23, we have been releasing infographics. I think we're done from goals 1 to 11, and we're just about to release the last set from 12 to 17. Both the fact sheets and the infographics, we work with civil society. So there's a community spotlight in each one of the infographics where we highlight civil society activities and their data for SDGs. We've developed a quality assurance tool to assess civil society and other data for SDG reporting. We've developed and implemented a progress measure for SDGs. We continue to work internationally on SDGs through the IAAG, this group here, as well as on some other things. We've helped some of the countries in the Caribbean on their SDG reporting. And we are doing an analysis on the overlapping frameworks to the SDGs and how to make sense of all of these frameworks as they've come together. Next slide, please. We've also been helpful on the VNR. So in 2018, Canada released its first VNR. In that first VNR, Statistics Canada only had a small role. The development of the VNR was extraordinarily political, and the VNR had little data. Our colleagues at Global Affairs Canada, at the 11th hour before it was due to the UN, reached out to us and said, you've got to put some data in here. We're not going to look very good. So we had 24 hours to try to put some data in that first VNR. And in many cases, it was just within the chapter, we put a couple of indicators at the bottom because we did not have time to do that. However, in 2023, we are releasing the second VNR, and we have a major role in this. We are doing the statistical annex. We have put the progress measure in the statistical annex, and the statistical annex is going to look a little bit different. It's almost like a standalone report. It is very data heavy with context in it and analysis in it. And it's got the charts and tables, etc. However, we were not funded to do this work. That $500,000 a year was not, there were no funds earmarked for doing a voluntary national review. And because we wanted to do such a large statistical annex, we were able to secure extra funding to do this work. So we actually got another $28,000 to be able to do the VNR annex. It didn't cover all of the costs of doing the annex and also reviewing for appropriateness and consistency and good data, the main part of the VNR work, but it covered a fairly large chunk of the work that we've done. And how we negotiated that was, just we went back to the budget documents and said, this is what we're funded for. This is what we're not funded for. So if you want us to do that, we will have to receive funding. Particularly in the last year, Statistics Canada has had some budget constraints. And so in order to be able to free up staff to do that and take them off of other projects, we had to be able to have them funded. So you can go to the next slide, please. So we're starting the comprehensive review. So the 2025 comprehensive review will be done in 2024. We will coordinate and compile all the national comments. We will also represent the United States on this and compile the comments and submit them for the US. But in 2024, we have a comprehensive review of the Canadian indicator framework. And this will take place, we'll start it this year so that we're completed by 2024. We'll manage the review from start to finish. And this will be a challenging review because I'm not sure if Bo found this, but certainly for the domestic indicators, many times departments feel like they only want to have indicators that show good news. So it's going to be difficult to manage their expectations of how much can change within the indicator framework. And we're already working on managing those expectations and talking to them about how you need to have, consistency across time so that you're able to actually see progress. But we continue to work with them. Next slide, please. So this all takes collaboration. So we have international collaborations, so such as this one. We have collaborative working relationships with other NSOs around the world. Lots of times when we're facing issues, we will reach out to other NSOs to ask them how are they addressing things. Intergovernmental, so we work with all the other federal departments, and it's particularly for the domestic indicator framework. We ensure that those were built aligning with the national priorities of the government so that they could see their priorities reflected in the Canadian Indicator Framework for SDGs. We have good relationships with civil society, and through the partnerships that we've created highlighting their data, we've provided them with a tool to evaluate unofficial data. We have had various meetings with them to show them how the tool works and how to use it. And then we've had some external partnerships through academia. So Oxford University in the UK, Waterloo University in Canada, and various human rights entities. So we've worked with, we try to collaborate as much as we can, but we're a very small team. Next slide, please. So resourcing, so that 500,000 doesn't actually get you that much. Once you take into consideration, IT costs and communications dissemination costs that charge us for some of the work that we do. So we have a very small but dedicated team. We have 3 people that work full time. One is a new recruit, one is a junior, they just finished their recruitment, and one is a unit head, so mid-level. We have 2 senior levels to provide strategic guidance and vision, but they do not work full time on SDGs. The key that we found is to know what you want to do and then find the people with the skill sets to do that. So we've been very picky about hiring, and so in some cases we've left positions empty for quite a while until we get the right people. So we knew this last time we needed people with strong R and Python skills, and we were able to find people to do that. We have someone who's essentially a graphic designer who's been able to help us greatly. And then how do you convince people to let you do it? Well, we found that we illustrate what we can do. So we take things right to the chief statistician and say, this is what we can do, because sometimes we skirt the rules a little bit of, I guess many of you are with government, so you would understand that there are often rules on how things look and feel. It has to be common across government. Some of our products are not. They do not meet those things, but they're very innovative. And so we've been able to illustrate to the chief statistician, here's what we can do. Do we have your approval? He's seen what we can do. He trusts us, and now he lets us go ahead and run with the initiatives that we've got. Next slide, please. Oh, perfect. That's everything. So thank you very much.
We thank you, Cara. Thank you for a very inspiring presentation. I hope you can stick around for at least maybe 20 more minutes if possible. We would now I would now like to open the second part of the discussion time with a similar proposal. So I will leave this question to the audience. Which additional resources would make a difference in your SDG monitoring efforts? And from the examples, you can essentially see what was shared today. And this is why I say that there is definitely a common thread between all of the presentations and not just between the presentations that were grouped together. So as we were able to realize, resources come in different shapes and sizes. So whether it's staff or funding or partnerships with data providers and therefore accessing new data sets, expertise, legal coordination mandate, monitoring, political buy-in or engagement, you name it, please think about it and get back to me. And in the meantime, I would like to pose a question, which is the same question to both my fellow panel members, but I hope I'm able to specify what I would like from each of you to zoom in. So the question is, can you highlight specific data gaps that this additional funding allowed to cover? and which areas benefited the most. And in the Netherlands case, I would be very interesting to understand the increases in data availability, because as you, like the areas, just thematic areas or maybe SDGs, because as you mentioned earlier, when Lineke promoted that consultation, you realized that initially your the level of indicators that you were able to monitor vis-a-vis the global list wasn't too high. So that increase, in which areas do you think you gained the most from both the additional funding and the communication gains, the partnerships? And on Canada's side, and perhaps I would start with you, Cara, I would be very interested to know a little bit more about your innovative approach. So maybe the citizen-generated data, the sources that you got from non-traditional, the data that you got from non-traditional sources, and in which way this funding allowed for you to progress in that dimension. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. Did you want me to start, or do you want Bo to start? I'm sorry.
Yes, you, Cara. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so the funding. The funding didn't cover any new data acquisition, data collections. It did cover data acquisition. If we needed to purchase some data, we have not purchased any data so far. We've been able to acquire data without having to purchase it, but we do have to process it. But what we were able to do with some of that funding was, in fact, get better data disaggregation. And that was because we had people who had the skills to be able to use the OpenSDG hub and to use R and Python to be able to create a hub that uses an API that can call the data, and we can pull it in without having to go through our dissemination people. Because when our original hub was heavy labor intensive, and so every disaggregation everything was manual intervention, and now we're able to program so we can put the data disaggregation. So that's where we were able to actually fill gaps. And I have to say that we've been audited twice by the Auditor General of Canada, and that actually helped, because those audits showed that we needed more data disaggregation. So there was more of a drive to let us use innovative tools to be able to get that data disaggregation and respond to the audit recommendations. For the CGD, the funding wasn't really linked to citizen-generated data. If in our community spotlights, we actually just cold call various civil society groups. We see something, we do big searches online. What have they got? What are they doing? This looks kind of interesting. And then we start cold calling them and meeting with them to find out, are you interested? We take a look at their various annual reports, and we make sure that we're comfortable enough, but we don't guarantee the quality of that information, but that we're comfortable enough to be able to use it. And so that's how we've been able to harness some of the work that they're doing, because our belief from the very beginning was that it's a whole of society approach to achievement of the SDGs, that government alone couldn't do it. Civil society wanted to see themselves in the reporting, and we couldn't figure out how potentially they could report at, say, a Canada level, when perhaps the group, there's only a group that's working in one part of the country, and they only have data on a specific part of the country. So how do you put that in your national reporting? So we felt that this was the best option for us, was to put community spotlights and highlight some of the data and activities that they're doing to show that it's government alone can't achieve the SDGs. So I hope that's answered your question.
It definitely does, Cara. Thank you so much. And now I would give the floor to Bo, to her side of things.
Yes, I hope I can properly answer this question. Let me think. Just looking at the new data that is going to be available with the new funding, because we are still in the process of making this, making the new indicators and really exploiting this new data. I think you can say it's almost every topic except things that have something to do with money, because we already had those, and also nothing about the environment. So more the social aspects, but also sustainability of cities, those kind of topics. There was already a lot of data available, but because the focus hadn't been on these specific global indicators, they just weren't explored further and never been used. So a large part of the new data that's, at least for the SDG, it's new data that's becoming available, is data that was already produced, but has never been on the radar to be used as an SDG indicator. Another thing that we really noticed was when the SDGs kind of merged with the Monitor of Wellbeing, the publication became really big. We have in the Netherlands a day which is called Accountability Day, and it's the 17th of May, so it's almost. And that report is used within our government to see what has happened over the last year, but also the last 8 years, and they really use it to hold themselves accountable, so to say. And because of the impact this report has, a lot of people within Statistics Netherlands in some way work on this, because they make a really small part of the data at a different department than that I am in. And that really creates a lot of goodwill for them to do work for us without our department having to pay their department to do it. So these partnerships, and also we can use their staff and their capacity and their skills, really allows us to do more work than it's covered with the money that we have, basically. So I think that's also an important development that we see, just because we have more time and we can really develop the partnership. So also within Statistics Netherlands, it really allows us more capacity than we actually have in our own team. So I think that's my answer.
And it's a very, very good one. And I think there's a common thread here in, despite the fact that additional funding was, of course, of major importance in both cases, it didn't come to just that. So the communication routines that the Netherlands have established, the cold calls, was it, Cara, made to civil society. So all of these seemingly informal processes that become more routine and more enshrined into the institutional practices have also helped in improving SDG. The SDG monitoring. And now I would give the floor to Liva, which I think has a question.
Not the question, maybe just a comment to your, or answer to your question on the screen. Thank you both for very interesting presentations. And I think I also agree to this, that it doesn't come down to the money always. I mean, we still need the very good partnerships, and we also need to see the opportunities to link this work to other work going on in our organizations and in our country, because we are now just about to embark on the quality of life indicators, and I think it's very strongly linked to the SDGs. And also partnerships with those who can actually help us out with the expert evaluation of the indicators, because that's, I think, is a bottleneck for us, that we don't have the necessary resources at hand to kind of evaluate, is this a good indicator? How can we use it? How should we evaluate it? And I also then love the idea of Malta to have this kind of a task force. We would have loved to have that in Norway too, but I mean, that's a priority. And that's my second point, you know, this not listed here, but it's the priority. This is also a resource that we sometimes lack. Yes, thank you.
Excellent, Liva. Thank you. And definitely, we need help in prioritizing, because we're supposed to monitor. Now I think we still have time. Let me just check if there are. Yes, we have a question from Magda, Poland. Please go ahead.
Carolina, I don't think it's a question, just a remark or conclusion, because you talked about common threads. I can see here additional common thread. I think that it's not the coincidence that you, co-chair of the communication task team, lead this session, because I can see that the common thread for this brilliant, really interesting presentation is also communication, and the communication of statistics in many dimensions, and especially about the value of statistics, because I think that behind these successful stories is the communication of the usefulness of statistics and of it, what we can provide and how much it costs. And I think that before the break, you posed the question about this experiences when the SDGs boosted some strategic things. I think the Poland is the example when it worked, because we boosted at the political level and in statistical production level. We, I think, are, as the Statistics Poland, very visible among our institutions, and we closely cooperate in SDGs from the very beginning. SDGs also helped us to develop some statistical production, to develop big data production. But one unsuccessful story is our funding. And I think this is the point for us and remark to maybe more communicate how much it costs and what we could do more with additional funding. I've got also the small question to Bo Netherlands. You said that you gained the funding for every 4 years, and you used it among others to develop new indicators. So I would like to ask you whether these indicators are calculated only during this only once for the 4 years, or once they are developed, you produce them then on the regular basis using your basic funds, or do you need additional funding every 4 years? Thank you.
We update the existing data set every year. We start the process of funding, let's say when the 4 years are up. At year 3, we already start the negotiations for the new funding, so that we never have a year without funding, so that in theory we could not update. However, the reports are getting so big that even if that would happen, it's most likely that our statistical office would fund it basically out of their own pocket because of the impact that it has. And creating new indicators is also a year-round process. So we do it every year. We make, it's kind of agreed upon that we look at 2 or 3 SDGs every year, and they rotate to see if we can improve. So do we need to add indicators? Are there new developments in society which trigger us to add stuff? So we see now their inflation is really high, the house prices are going through the roof, so we get a lot of questions. Why don't we have specific indicators about the cost of just your house, like maintaining your house, paying your rent, that kind of stuff. So then the discussions are starting, should we add indicators regarding that? And that is the process that continues, and it doesn't really matter how long we have the funding. That is just a continuous process. So we monitor every year, we update every year, and every year some indicators are under review to see if they're still measuring what we want them to measure. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I think that we're right on time, though I wouldn't mind having one more, or I would mind actually, sorry. But before I share with you my final remarks, my conclusions, I would just like to say that a lot of what has already been said by both the speakers and the people asking questions already summarizes a lot of what was highlighted today. And I'm not lying because they had my preliminary conclusions. And they can confirm. But I think that this just goes to show that there is so much to be done, but there are already such interesting approaches to what can be done. I think that I hope that it was visible. And now I start by making my final remarks and overall conclusions on this session, which is partnerships are definitely key to responding to user demands, both on the statistical side and also on the political policymaking side. They are key to reducing burden, to increasing the value and visibility of official statistics, and to overall strengthen, and in this case particularly regarding the NSOs, to strengthen our coordination role even beyond the SDGs. And I think that these partnerships, given the immense plurality of the SDG context, are even more relevant, and they help us face the ever-present resource constraints. We have also found, and this was, I think, in both presentations, that partnerships and resources are definitely interconnected. So the more partnerships you have, the less scarcity you are likely to face, whether it is in accessing data, in processing it, in coordinating, in facilitating contacts with the global level. So that was really, I think, a key conclusion. And then one of the more overarching conclusions for all of the presentation, including the presentation from the policymaking side, is that SDGs can be leveraged and should be leveraged to boost several overarching goals. So they can streamline strategic planning, as it was the case in Slovakia. They can strengthen the coordination role of the NSO, as it was made very visible from Malta's presentation, but also in I think, Netherlands' case, Canada's case. They can be leveraged to improve communication routines with national data providers. They can be used to incorporate or to highlight, as Kara put it, data from civil society through either quality assurance techniques or just by giving it a platform. They can also be used to innovate. They can be used to increase overall data availability, but also granularity, which, although it wasn't the issue with this session, we know that it's, when we talk about data availability, we are sometimes talking about totals. And when it comes to leaving no one behind, that's when resources are really, really useful and oftentimes scarce. We have also mentioned the VNRs, and we have understood that they can be leveraged to secure additional resources, as it was the case in Canada, to accelerate both implementation, as it was the case with Slovakia, and monitoring in Canada. But we have also seen that they are sometimes, and using Kvitozlav's expression, too red carpet, meaning that because they are country driven, and we are not disputing that assumption, they sometimes showcase what the country wants to showcase. And I think that in Canada's case, Kara briefly mentioned that the statistical annex will be almost a publication in itself. And I can early on share that would be very similar to the Portuguese case. And I think that this may be a way to overcome some independency concerns. We have also learned, I promise that I only have like 5 more conclusions. We have also learned that we should, as NSIs, definitely profit from the evidence-based VNR's momentum, which we are currently living, because as many of us might remember, in the first edition of our country's VNRs, the role of statistical offices was much more limited than what it is considered to be today, and we should definitely use it to increase our visibility and the value of official statistics. And I'm now coming to my very final remarks, which is ask and you may receive. And I think that this was learning how to ask is, I think that the Netherlands and Canada provided almost a roadmap on how to ask, and the Maltese case of calling the office and saying, look, we cannot cope with this endless burden cycle. If you want us to do better, give us the tools, whether or not they come in coordination shape. And this was very relevant, and I hope that it's important and replicable for many of us when we get back to our national context. This brings me to my next final conclusion, which is resources do come in many different shapes and sizes. They can be financial, they can be political buy-in, as we saw in Slovakia and Malta, and even Canada, although sometimes the political buy-in, and I know Cara would agree, isn't always what we expected. They can come in accessing new data sets, data integration, data coordination, or statistical system coordination. And finally, civil society definitely provides key input, whether through citizen-generated data, as it was the case in Canada, or by shaping the way the NSO is forced to react, as it was the case in Malta, and it was highlighted by the Netherlands with the very positive feedback from the proactive development of the first publication. And they can also contribute to the shaping of a national strategy, as it was the case in Slovakia. So I hope you have all found this presentation, this session, this topic as interesting as I did. And with that, I would give the floor back to our co-chairs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolina, for this very interesting and inspiring session this afternoon. I'm going to be very brief. I have two things to say. One thing is from a Swedish perspective. It's more like ask, but you will still not receive. And but to end this meeting on a slightly more positive note, I wish that dreamers like Ketoslav would like to talk more with statistical dreamers like us, and not least at an earlier stage. I think that is key. So partnerships again. With that, I thank you for today and close this session. And